Okay, today's daf is Lamed in Yoma. We're going to start on Kaftet, Amud Bet, second to last line. So the Mishnah spoke about some rules. It opened up some rules about entering the Bet HaMikdash. We're getting into rules that apply to the Kohen, but also rules that are going to apply to average people, we're going to see. And then it will move into a discussion of Avodat Yom Kippurim, the actual procedure of Yom Kippur. So the Mishnah had said that Kol HaMesechet Raglav Ta'un Tevilah. Anybody who goes to the bathroom has to go to Tevilah, has to immerse in a mikveh before he goes into the Bet HaMikdash. And V'chol HaMatil Mayim, anybody who urinates, Ta'un Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim, he has to wash his hands and feet, because the Kohen would wash his hands and feet from the kior, he would wash from the spout that they had, he would wash his hands and his feet. So the Gemara says, Bishlama raglayim mishum nitzotzot. We understand why if the Kohen goes to urinate, he has to wash his feet, his legs, because drops will go onto his legs. So he has to be clean. Ela yadayim mai ta'ama. But what is the reason why he has to wash his hands? If he goes to urinate, maybe he didn't touch anything. Obviously if he touched his body when he was doing it, he would have to, but let's say he didn't touch anything. Amar Rabbi Abba said, Zot omeret, this comes to tell you that mitzvah l'shafshef biyado, Rashi has. Okay, if you look at Rashi, he adds the word biyado. Okay, but the point is, as we turn to Lamed Amud Aleph, that it's a mitzvah to wipe away the drops with your hands. That's what Rashi says. He adds a word that in our text of the Gemara it says mitzvah l'shafshef, but Rashi says mitzvah l'shafshef biyado. In other words, you have to shake off the drops with your hand, or wipe them away with your hand. And that means, and what was the reason for this? The reason for this was, actually the Gemara is going to tell us, Misayale, this supports the Rebbe Ami. What Rabbi Ami said. Amar Rabbi Ami, because Rabbi Ami said, a person can't go out with drops of urine on their legs. Now remember, they used to go to the bathroom out in the field, so then you would walk, people would see you. They wore these open, sort of the toga type thing. People could see your legs. They would see you have wetness on your legs. Why not? Because people will think that he has a problem. His system doesn't work properly. Okay, and then they will think, so what's going to happen? People are going to say, oh, this guy's urine drips on his legs. Obviously that means he's impotent, right? His system does not function, and he has kids. Obviously his kids are not his. Right? His wife must be, with somebody else, because where did the kids come from? Because we know that this guy, he can't have kids, because look, he has. So they didn't want people to assume about others that they were impotent, because then they would assume about their children that they weren't really theirs, that they were mamzerim, and because of that concern, they said you have to wipe yourself off to make sure that you're clean. So therefore, what happens? If a person goes to urinate, they have to wash their hands. Why? Because we know that halachically they are required to wipe off any wetness from their legs, and their hands are going to be dirty, so they have to wash their hands before they return to the avodah. This is the halacha. So we learned this also in Masechet Berachot. Amar Rav Papa says, "So'ah bimkoma asur likrot kriyat shema." If a person has so'ah, the person has now incidentally, this has nothing to do with what we've learned up till now. This is just a side point. Okay, like on the side it says in Hagaot Maharav Ransberg, if you see the side, he says there that the reason why Mishum de Katane Matnitin Kol HaMesech Raglav Ta'un Tevilah. Okay, that since the Mishnah had mentioned this idea and the Gemara had mentioned this idea of cleaning yourself after going to the bathroom to make sure that there's no residue on you or anything like that, so now it mentions a general halacha that pertains to Kriyat Shema that we learned about in Masechet Berachot, which is that if a person has excrement on their body, okay, they can't read the Shema, and he says Bim Koma, if it's in its place, meaning that he hasn't cleaned himself properly in the actual place where the excrement comes. So it's not that it's on his leg, under his, or something like that, or on his side, or on his foot, but it's actually in the place where it comes out. In that case, he can't read Kriyat Shema. What are we talking about here? If it's visible, so it's visible excrement, so then pshita, obviously he's not allowed to read the Shema because it's visible. If it's not visible, I mean, the Torah was not given to angels. If it's not visible, so how can we hold them responsible for something that's not visible? So the Gemara answers, and this is the same answer that we're given in Masechet Berachot, that the Yoshev v'nir lo tzricha. It's necessary the Yoshev v'nir'et, omed ve'nan nir'et. It depends. when he's sitting down, it would be visible. In other words, it's in a location in his body that when he sits down, you could see it. But when he's standing up, it would be hidden inside his body. So there, even though when he's standing, it's hidden inside his body, he can't read the Shema because it's still there and could be exposed when he sits down. Okay? So that's what Rav Papa says. So a person has to clean themselves carefully when they go to the bathroom before doing tefillah or reading the Shema. Because if there is any excrement still in that place, the person will not be allowed to read the Shema. Even if it's not visible unless he sits down, still the fact that it's there means that he's responsible for it. The Gemara raises an issue here. It says, "Umay shena mitzoal b'saro." Why is excrement in its place any different than excrement on your leg or somewhere else on your body? And we learned Idmar because we learned so'a al bisaro, if a person has excrement on their body, arm or leg, or shayu yadav v'veta kiseh, or he has his hands in the bathroom. Now, what's the case of hands in the bathroom? You're next to the wall of the bathroom, and there's an opening, and you put your hand is inside there. I don't know why you would have your hand inside there. Whatever, I don't know why. But you have your hand inside there, you're handing somebody something in there, and you want to know, am I considered to be in the bathroom? No, I'm standing outside, but there's a hole in the wall I put my hand through. So my hand is in there. So what's my status? So this is again mentioned, this is a sugya from Masechet Berachot. Rav Huna Amar Mutar, the Krot Kriyat Shema, Rav Chizda Amar Asur the Krot Kriyat Shema bimkoma. Asur the Krot Kriyat Shema. That Rav Huna says that the person who has excrement on their body or who has his hands inside the bathroom, even though his body is outside the bathroom, okay, he is allowed to read the Shema, Rav Huna says. Rav Chizda says no, he's not allowed. He's not allowed. Now we're talking about excrement that's covered. In other words, you have it on your body, but you're wearing clothes, so it's covered by the clothes. Because if it were exposed, well, even if it's on the ground and exposed, you wouldn't be able to read the Shema. So certainly if it's on your body and exposed, you wouldn't be allowed to read it. But it's talking about where you're wearing clothing. So since you're wearing clothing, and the clothing is covering it, well, the question is the fact that it's on your body a concern? Okay? Now, what Rashi says is that what is Rav Chizda's reason for prohibiting? Rav Huna's reason for permitting you to read the Shema, even though there's excrement on your body, but it's covered. So he says it's covered, it's okay. Rav Chizda says no. It says, Kal atzmotai tomarna Hashem yichamocha. All my body has to be pure to say Hashem yichamocha. Okay? In other words, my whole body. So even if my hands are in the bathroom, but my body is outside, it doesn't matter that most of my body is outside. No, your whole body has to be in a place where you can say the Shema. Because it's Kal Atzmotai, all my body. So what does he say? But what do you see from that? You see that we're apparently not concerned about the smell. Because if it's on my leg and it's covered by my pants, let's say, still, according to Rav Chizda, I can't read the Shema. According to Rav Huna, I can. But nobody seems to make a distinction about the excrement that's in the place where it comes out. In other words, excrement that's in the anus, in the place where it comes out. There, Rav Papa is saying there's a unique halacha that you can't read the Shema. But what about the machloket here? It doesn't. Even Rav Chizda, who's stringent, is only stringent because Kal atzmotai tomarna Hashem yichamocha. Okay, so it's a different reason. So the Gemara answers, Bimkoma nafish zoama. Shelo bimkoma lo nafish zoama. That it depends. Anywhere else on your body where you have excrement, it's not going to smell as bad. It's not going to be as offensive. And as long as it's covered, Rav Huna says it's okay to say the Shema. Rav Chizda says no. Even though it doesn't smell, you shouldn't say the Shema because it's still on you. And we say Kal atzmotai tomarna Hashem yichamocha. But when it's in its natural place and it hasn't yet fully come out, so there it's especially the smell is especially bad according to Rav Papa, and everybody would agree you can't say the Shema in that case. Okay.
Does apply only to the Kohen or
anybody can't say the Shema. Anybody can't say the Shema. Then the rabbis taught halacha b'seudah. Here's a law relating to meals. Adam yotel hashtin mayim. A person who goes to urinate outside in the bathroom, notel yado achat v'nichnas. Then when he comes back to the meal, he only has to wash one hand because he only used the one hand. He doesn't have to wash both hands. Okay. If he wants to come back to continue the meal, he's sitting at a meal. Yeah. They wash netilat yadayim. They're eating bread. He has to go to the bathroom. He only uses his one hand to go to the bathroom, so he only has to wash one hand when he comes back.
So how you wash it?
Meaning he has to pour water over the one hand to continue eating. Right. So you have to wash. Well, we all wash both hands for cleanliness nowadays, but then it was more complicated. They didn't have sinks, so running water. Yeah. So now it says Diberim Chavero v'hiflig. If he went outside of the meal and he talked to his friend for a long time, Rashi says an hour or two. He's having a long conversation out there for an hour in the hallway, and then he comes back in. So there it says. Notel shetei yadav v'nichnas. He has to wash his two hands before he comes back to the meal. Uchishu notel lo yitol mibachutz. And when he washes his hands, he shouldn't do it outside v'yikanes. Why not? Mipnei chashad. Because people will assume he didn't wash his hands because they didn't see him. Okay? So you should go back into the room where they're eating and you should wash your hands in there. Ela nichnas v'yoshev b'mkomo. He should come in, sit back in his place. Notel yadav, shetei yadav, wash his two hands. Umachzir tafiach ala orachin, and then he should offer the cup to everyone else, meaning to show that he was washing his hands. Say, would anybody else like to wash their hands? So everyone could see that he did. Okay, so now everyone will see that he was careful to wash his hands after leaving the room for a while. This is only true if you came back to drink wine, because what they used to do was after they ate the meal and the bread was finished, they would sit and drink for a while. So this person went out and talked with his friend for an hour. He comes back in and he wants to continue the meal just drinking. So there it says you have to wash your hands in front of everybody. Why? Because people will say, this guy probably didn't wash his hands because drinking is not as important as eating bread. He probably didn't wash his hands. He probably wasn't careful. So you have to wash in front of everybody. However, if you're coming back in to eat bread, that everybody understands, everybody assumes if you're going to come back and eat bread, that you're going to wash your hands anyway. Nobody's going to suspect that you didn't wash your hands. Why? Because when a person gets involved in a conversation, they're doing other activities, they're not that careful about where their hands are going, right? They have busy hands. The Talmud always says, Yadaim askaniotem. Right? The hands are busy. In other words, so nobody wants to go and just sit down and eat food again with their hands when they weren't paying attention to where their hands were. Okay? So if a person went out to talk with their friend for an hour and came back, our assumption is going to be that definitely they washed both of their hands when they came back. If the person is coming back just to have a drink, we might think, okay, he probably didn't wash his hands. But halachically, he has to wash his hands. Why? Because we're concerned that maybe he will take another piece of bread when he's drinking. So the halacha is he has to wash his hands because he might take a piece of bread when he's drinking. But he has to wash his hands inside the room so people know that he did. If he's coming back in the middle of the meal where he's definitely going to eat food, then everybody will assume he washed his hands anyway. That's what the practice is. So now, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak va'ana afilu lishtot nami medai yada'ed aninat da'atai. He says, you know what? When it comes to me, everyone knows I'm so careful about washing my hands all the time that even if I came back into the room just in order to drink, everybody will assume I washed my hands, so I don't have to wash them in front of everyone. But most people will assume if they came back in to eat, they washed their hands. If they came back in to drink, maybe they didn't wash their hands. They're not going to touch the food. They're only going to touch the cup. They have all kinds of reasons why they wouldn't worry about it. The new Mishnah says, "En adam nichnas la'azara la'avoda afilu ta'orat she'yitvol." It says that a person cannot go into the azara to serve. In other words, a person can't go into the Beit HaMikdash to do avodah. That means a kohen or even a non-kohen who comes in just to participate in whatever way a non-kohen can in the worship in the Beit HaMikdash, has to do tevilah. He has to, even if he's tahor, even if he's pure, he doesn't know of any impurity that he has has to go to the mikveh first. Okay? Chamesh tevilot v'asara kiddushin tovel kohen gadol u'mekadesh bo bayom. There were 5 tevilot and 10 kiddushin. Kiddushin means washing of the hands and feet. There were washing of the hands and feet is called kiddush yadayim v'raglayim.
Oh, kiddush.
Yeah. So the kohen gadol would 5 times go into the mikveh and 10 times do kiddush yadayim v'raglayim on Yom Kippur. And we're going to learn about all these details. We read about it in the Musaf of Yom Kippur. Yarad v'taval v'alav v'nistapag. All of that is the chamesh tevilot, right? And kidesh yadav v'raglav is he had to wash his hands and feet. in between changing of the clothes. We're going to learn more details about this coming up. Kulan bakodesh. All of the tevilot that he did, all of the immersions that he did were bakodesh, in the Beit HaMikdash itself, al Beit HaParva, on the roof of the Beit HaParva, as we learned earlier in the Masechet. Chutz mizo bilvad, except for this one, meaning the first one, that everybody has to do before they come in the Beit HaMikdash. Even the Kohen Gadol had to do it before entering. It wasn't done in the Beit HaMikdash, it was done before going into the Beit HaMikdash. And chutz mizo bilvad, parasu sadin shel but beno levena'am. They put up a special silk curtain between the Kohen Gadol and everyone else, so that he could go in privacy to immerse, because everyone was gathered around, He needed some privacy to immerse, and then he would go in to begin his avodah. So everybody, though, had to do this tevilah, had to do this immersion before entering the Beit HaMikdash, including the Kohen Gadol. So because this is a generic requirement, it's not related to the service of Yom Kippur. So it's outside the Beit HaMikdash. Even the Kohen Gadol has to do it. The Gemara says, Shalu et Ben Zoma, they asked Ben Zoma, Tevilah Zolam. Why does everybody who enters the Beit HaMikdash have to go for Tevilah, have to go to the mikveh? If they know that they are tahor, why should they have to do it? So he said to them, Amar lahem, Oma ha-mishaneh mikodesh lekodesh, u'mimakom she'anush karet lamakom she'anush karet, ta'un tevilah. If the person who changes from one holiness to another, or from a place where there is a penalty of karet on entering in a state of impurity, or from a place to a place that is to another place where it's anush karet, right? He requires tevilah. In other words, even though the Kohen Gadol is perpetually in a place where he needs to guard himself from impurity, because he's in the Beit HaMikdash the whole time that he's doing the service, and yet because he's changing from one aspect of Kodesh to another, he's going to the Kodesh HaKodashim, then he's outside in the Kodesh, he's in the Chatzer, which is the third level, the lowest level of Kiddush of the Beit HaMikdash. He's going from one to the other, and he's changing, right? He keeps changing from Bigdei Lavan to Bigdei Zahav, the clothing that's white to the golden clothing, depending on which part of the Avodah he's doing, and yet every time he changes his focus from this part of the Beit HaMikdash, or that part, or this part of the Avodah, or another part, he has to do Tevilah. To switch, he's always doing Yarad v'Taval v'Alav v'Nistapag. Each time he puts on changes the bigadim, he has to do another tevilah. So if that's true, then he says Hamishaneh mechol lakodesh u'makom she'en anush karet u'makom she'anush karet en odin she'ta'un tevilah. Ben Zoma said, I mean, if a person who's going from holiness to holiness, like the Kohen Gadol, from one aspect of holiness to another, from one area that you have to be pure in to another area that you have to be pure in, then somebody who's going from Chol to Kodesh, somebody who's going from the streets to the Beit HaMikdash, from a place where they don't have to be pure to a place where they have to be pure, from a place where there are, where there are no restrictions to a place where there are lots of restrictions, certainly they have to do Tevilah. If the Kohen inside the Beit HaMikdash has to do Tevilah when he switches from one kind of holiness to another, then going from Chol to Kodesh definitely requires Tevilah. That's what Ben Zoma says.
So every location they have a mikvah there from when he changed?
They had one in the Beit HaMikdash that the Kohen Gadol would keep going back to the mikveh during the service.
So when he changed from one location to another location?
When he changed the clothes.
Yeah, they have a mikvah.
There was a mikvah on the roof of one of the chambers. He would have to go up there. He would go, come out, dry off, put his clothes on, and continue. 5 times.
5 times.
Yeah. So if that requires so much tevilah, then certainly a regular guy who comes from wherever and he comes to the Beit HaMikdash, certainly he has to do tevilah. That's what Ben Zoma says. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Serach tevilah hizo. He says, no, this is just an imitation tevilah. It's not really required. What does he mean? Kedei sheyizkor tum'ah yeshana shebiyado v'yifrosh. He says, this tevilah is not really required. Rabbi Yehuda says it's not a requirement from the Torah. Ben Zoma is saying the Torah requires it. Because if the Torah requires for the Kohen Gadol 5 times tevilah, then Kal V'chomer, certainly for the person who comes from outside the Beit HaMikdash to inside the Beit HaMikdash has to do tevilah. It's min Torah. It's required, even if you weren't tameh at all. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, this was a rabbinic thing that they made you do tevilah. Why? Because when you go to do tevilah, you're going to remember, you know what? I am tameh. I forgot I was tameh. And then you'll leave. In other words, the fact that you have to go to the mikveh reminds you of any tum'ah yeshana shebiyado. Any older tum'ah that you might have forgotten about, and now you have to correct. So it's a safeguard. It's a safeguard that you're going to make sure that you remember any tum'ah that you might have neglected to fix.
That's from the Torah or from rabbinic?
What?
That's from the Torah?
He's saying it's rabbinic.
Rabbinic.
Ben Zoma is saying it's biblical. You must go to the mikveh right before you go into the Beit HaMikdash. Anybody who goes in. Rabbi Yehuda is saying it's not biblical. If you were totally tahor, you don't need to do a tevilah.
So how
However, we're going to make you do one anyway, even though you don't need to. Why? Because maybe when you go to do a tevilah, you're going to remember that you're really tameh.
Oh.
Okay, they just want to give you a reminder. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. What are they arguing about? We turn to Lamed Amud Bet. They're arguing about if a person were to come in, let's say a Kohen comes in, a regular Kohen, not the Kohen Gadol, not on Yom Kippur, any old day, comes, doesn't go to the mikveh before he goes in. This Kohen is tahor. But he didn't do it, he didn't go to the mikveh before he went in. He just walked in. They're arguing, will that disqualify the avodah that he does? Leven zoma mechil avodah. The Rabbi Yehuda lo mechil avodah. According to Ben Zoma, this tevilah before you go into the Beit HaMikdash for anybody, Kohen or non-Kohen, is required min Torah. Biblically required. So what does that mean? That means if the Kohen didn't do it, he didn't do tevilah, even if he was tahor. He was 100% tahor, he didn't touch anything. But he didn't do this extra tevilah when he came in. Any avodah that he does, pasul. Invalid. Rabbi Yehuda says, no. This immersion in the mikveh is only a safeguard to remind you. Right? It's only a safeguard. You don't really need to do it. It's not from the Torah according to Rabbi Yehuda. So if it's not from the Torah, what does that mean? That it's certainly not going to invalidate the avodah if you forgot to do it. If you forgot to do it, you forgot to do it. Okay? So that's that uleven zoma. But wait, is that really the difference between them? Uleven zoma mi mechil. Will Ben Zoma really say that if somebody didn't go to the mikveh right before going into the Beit HaMikdash, and they went and they did the service in the Beit HaMikdash, that it's invalid? Ve'atanya, we learned in a Braita, Kohen Gadol shelo taval velo kidesh ben beged lebeged uben avodah lavodah avodato kshera, that it says that about the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, if he failed to do one of the tevilot between changing his clothes, or he forgot to wash his hands and feet between changing the clothes, his avodah is still acceptable. Echad Kohen Gadol, ve'echad Kohen Hedyot, shelo kidesh yadav v'raglav shacharit ve'avad avodah, avodato pesula. However, if a person failed to wash his hands and feet in the morning, and did the service, then it's pasul. So what does it say? Any Kohen Gadol or a regular Kohen, doesn't matter, must wash his hands and wash his feet in the morning before doing avodah. Must. Okay? If he didn't do tevilah in the morning though, he forgot to do it, it doesn't disqualify his avodah. But if he forgot to wash his hands and feet in the morning, his avodah is no good. But between beged and beged, in other words, the Kohen Gadol who has to do chamesh tevilot, and he has to immerse 5 times, and he has to wash his hands and feet 10 times in between changing the clothes. If the Kohen Gadol forgot to do one of those, we don't disqualify the service. Now Ben Zoma learned that if the Kohen Gadol has to do 5 tevilot on Yom Kippur, then certainly somebody who comes from Chol, who comes from outside the Beit HaMikdash to come in, must do a tevilah, right? But he learned it from what? From the Kohen Gadol. But if the Kohen Gadol himself forgets to do one of his tevilot, does it disqualify his avodah? No. Only if he forgot to do it in the morning, the first washing of the hands and feet. But if he forgot one of these in-between washings, it doesn't disqualify. So how could it disqualify? In other words, if that's where we learn that one must immerse before entering the Beit HaMikdash, we learn it from the case of the Kohen Gadol switching clothes. And the Kohen Gadol switching clothes, if he forgets to immerse, it doesn't disqualify his service. So if a regular Kohen who comes in the morning and doesn't immerse, it also can't disqualify his service. How could it be worse? We learned it from the Kohen Gadol. It can't be more strict than the Kohen Gadol. It can only be equal. So therefore, no, even according to Ben Zoma, who requires somebody to immerse, min HaTorah, he requires them to immerse when they come to the Beit HaMikdash. If a Kohen forgot to do it, as long as he washed his hands and feet, it doesn't disqualify the service. So, rather, what Ben Zoma and Rabbi Yehuda are arguing about is whether there is a positive commandment from the Torah for somebody to wash to immerse when they come in the morning to the Beit HaMikdash. So, the Ben Zoma ka'e ba'aseh, the Rabbi Yehuda lo ka'e ba'aseh, that according to Ben Zoma, it is a biblical commandment. It's min Torah. You must immerse in the morning. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it is not a biblical commandment. When you come to the Beit HaMikdash for the first time on that day, you do not have to. From the Torah, you don't have to immerse. Only the rabbis said immerse so that it will remind you if you might be tameh. Okay, but nobody holds that it disqualifies the avodah if you fail to do it. That it doesn't do. It doesn't disqualify. So now the Gemara asks, "Umi itle Rabbi Yehuda haisavara." Is it true that Rabbi Yehuda requires the person to immerse when they come to the Beit HaMikdash? Vatanya, but we learned in a Braita, Mitzorah tovel ve'omed b'shar nikanor. It says the Mitzorah. Remember, the Mitzorah has a lengthy process of purification. And then on the 8th day, he brings korbanot. And these korbanot, the blood and the oil from the service is put on his thumb. Right? He has to put his bohen yado hayemanit, bohen raglo hayemanit, his right toe, his right finger, right, and the ear, right? He has to, all these. Now what does he do? He stands at the eastern gate, outside of the Beit HaMikdash, technically, because he's not tahor yet, he can't come in yet. But he has to put his thumb in, he has to put his toe in, so that they can put the blood and the oil on the toes, and on the thumb. So it says he has to be tovel in the morning when he comes on that 8th day. He has to go to the mikveh. Then he goes to stand at the gate for the process to be done. Rabbi Yehuda Omer eino tzarich tevilah. Rabbi Yehuda says he doesn't need to go to tovel. Why? Shekvar taval mi ba'erev. Because he already did tevilah last night. In other words, what does the Mitzorah do? On the 7th day of his purification, he goes and he does tevilah. On the 7th day. And then on the 8th day, he comes to do the korbanot that complete his process. So if he's already went last night to do tevilah, he doesn't have to do it now. So Rabbi Yehuda is saying, even though it's a new day, it's the 8th day, he doesn't need to do tevilah when he comes to the Beit HaMikdash. So the Gemara answers, so what does that show you? That shows you that apparently Rabbi Yehuda is not that strict that you have to do tevilah when you come in the morning. So he says, no, that's not true. That's not a good example. Because what does Rabbi Yehuda say the reason is that this Mitzorah doesn't have to go to the mikveh in the morning? Because just last night he went to the mikveh. And if just last night he went to the mikveh, what's the reason according to Rabbi Yehuda that you have to go to the mikveh when you come to the Beit HaMikdash? Because it's going to remind you, maybe you're actually tameh. Okay, but if this guy already went to the mikveh last night, he already got reminded last night. But when the Mitzorah went to do his tevilah last night, he already got reminded. So he doesn't have to do it. But anybody else who shows up at the Beit HaMikdash does have to do it, according to Rabbi Yehuda. It's only that this Mitzorah, mipnei shekvar taval ba'erev. Because you already did it last night, that's why. So the Gemara says, but udika'arela, maika'arela. Why did the person who raised this situation, this case of the Braita, why did he bring it up? It's so obvious, because Rabbi Yehuda is, in other words, who brought this? They brought this as a challenge to Rabbi Yehuda. That, look, Rabbi Yehuda says you don't have to go to the mikveh when you come to the Beit HaMikdash. That's not true. He says the only reason he doesn't have to go to the mikveh is because he went last night. Not that he doesn't have to. He would have to. So why did they raise this at all? Because they wanted to show a contradiction within Rabbi Yehuda. How so? Because right here, what does Rabbi Yehuda say? That the Mitzorah does not have to do tevilah in the morning. Why not? Because he already did it last night. But look at this. Lishkata Mitzora'in. Shisham Mitzora'in Tovilin. That in Masechet Midot it says how there's a chamber of Mitzora'in, which is the place where the Mitzorah would go to, the Mitzora'in would go to do tevilah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Lo Mitzora'in bilvad amru, Ella kol adam. What does Rabbi Yehuda say? Not only does the Mitzorah have to go into this mikveh, but everybody has to. So what does that mean? The same rule that applies to everyone applies to Mitzorah. And what is the rule of everyone? Everyone has to go for tevilah when they come to the Beit HaMikdash. So wait a second. In the previous source, what did he say? In that Braita that we quoted before, he said what? Oh, the Mitzorah doesn't have to because he did it the night before. In this one, he says, oh no, everybody when they come to the Beit HaMikdash, Mitzorah and Kol Adam, they all have to go. So which one is it? So the Gemara tries to answer this a couple of ways. It says, Ella. What are we going to say? Lo kasha, no problem. Ha de tavil, ha de lo tavil. Maybe we're talking about a case where the mitzorah didn't do the mikveh last night. Because what was Rabbi Yehuda's reason for exempting the mitzorah? Because he did it last night. Maybe this mitzorah didn't do it last night. But if that's true, but then you have another problem, which is, remember, whenever somebody goes to the mikveh, they always require two things. They always require mikveh and Erev Shemesh. They have to wait for the sun to go down. Right. Otherwise, so what happens? If the mitzorah did not on the seventh day go to the mikveh, so what will happen? That if he waited till today, so now this becomes the seventh day. He's going to have to go to the mikveh today and wait for tonight and wait for tomorrow. It only works because on the seventh day before sunset, he went to the mikveh. So he had what was called Erev Shemesh. Okay? He had the sun went down, he fulfilled his obligation. But you're saying he didn't do Tevilah last night? It can't be. Ela idi v'idi de Tevil. Rather, everyone, it must be that the mitzorah went to Tevilah last night. Had de asah date, had de la asah date. But it depends. If the mitzorah was careful after going to the mikveh last night, let's say today's his 8th day. Last night he was very careful when he went to the mikveh. Yesterday afternoon, he was very careful. He didn't do anything to touch any tumah. He remembered he had to be very, very zariz, about it. So that guy, when he comes in the morning, according to Rabbi Yehuda, he doesn't have to go to the mikveh. But the asah date, let's say he went to the mikveh yesterday, and last night he forgot about it. He was drinking, he went out, velave malka, So then the next day, he has to go again. Okay, so the Gemara says, wait, ida sahdate. If you're telling me that he forgot, haza'at shlishush ve'iba'e. If somebody forgets to guard himself from tum'ah, not only does he have to go to the mikveh, he would have to get the ashes of the para aduma. Haza'at shlishush ve'i means he would have to wait till the 3rd day, put the para aduma. 7th day, put the para aduma, then go to the mikveh, and then be pure. Going to the mikveh won't be enough. The Amar Rav Dustai, because Rabbi Dustai said, Bar Matun said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Heseh hada'at tzarich haza'ah shlishu shve'i. That if somebody completely stopped paying attention to their tum'ah and tahorah status, they stopped paying attention to whether they were pure or impure, we have to assume the worst. We have to assume they might have come into contact with a dead body because they weren't thinking that they were going to the Beit HaMikdash. They weren't thinking about it. And therefore, they might be tameh tumat met and require the ashes of the para aduma on the 3rd day and the 7th day and then go to the mikveh. So if you're telling me he forgot that he needed to be tahor, we have to assume the worst. A mikveh is not going to be enough. He's going to have to do 7 days of purification from tumat met. But that can't be. So what is Rabbi Yehuda seems to be saying that there's a situation where he requires mikveh in the morning and there's a situation where he doesn't. But what could it be then? So there are 2 possible answers here. Or really 3. So first it says, Velo kasha. So Ela idi ve'idi, both of them are talking about the lo asach date. He definitely didn't forget. In other words, yesterday he went to the mikveh yesterday afternoon, and all last night he was very careful. He knew that he couldn't touch anything tameh. Vela kasha. And still there are some circumstances where he will have to go again to the mikveh in the morning, and some cases where he won't. Had tavil al dat biat mikdash. Had la tavil al dat biat mikdash. It depends. Did he go in, when he went in the mikveh, was he thinking, I'm just going into the mikveh in order to remove my impurity? Or was he thinking, I'm going into the mikveh to go into the Beit HaMikdash for a positive reason? Okay, if he only thought about the negative, that I'm removing the tum'ah, that's not enough. Right. Now in the morning he's going to have to go to the mikveh again saying, I'm doing it in order to enter the Beit HaMikdash. It has to be for a positive reason. But if last night he said, I'm doing this immersion both to remove the tum'ah and also to enable me to go tomorrow to the Beit HaMikdash, then it's good enough. V'bayit ema, alternatively, tini lo mitzora in amro ela kol adam. We could correct Rabbi Yehuda's words. Rabbi Yehuda said, lo mitzora in bilvad ela kol adam, right? That not only mitzoraim have to come and immerse here when they come to the Beit HaMikdash on the 8th day, but really anybody who's coming into the Beit HaMikdash has to immerse. That really Rabbi Yehuda didn't say the word bilvad. He said lo mitzora'in amro. It wasn't for mitzorain. Ella kol adam. Only regular people. In other words, according to that answer, there's never a time that the mitzorah has to immerse, according to Rabbi Yehuda, in the daytime. Because he went last night. So the first answer says it depends. If he intended to include both the removal of tum'ah and entering the Beit HaMikdash in his tevilah, then he's good. If he just wanted to remove the tum'ah, then in the morning he has to again do tevilah to enter the Beit HaMikdash. The second answer is saying, no, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's no such thing. If he went to the mikveh yesterday, he's fine. And what he meant to say was, lo mitzora in amro, ela kol adam. Not lo mitzora in bilvad. Because in reality, the mitzora in don't have to immerse when they come to the Beit HaMikdash, because they've already done it the night before. Ravina Amar, Rabbi Yehuda l'divrehim d'Rabbanan ka'amar. No. There's another way we can interpret Rabbi Yehuda. He's responding to what the rabbis say. L'didi mitzora in tarich tevilah. I hold, Rabbi Yehuda says, that a mitzora doesn't require immersion at all. But the didchu, according to you, oduli izi mihat. De lo mitzorain bilvad amru ela kol adam. At least agree with me that it's not just mitzoraim who need tevilah, it's everybody. In other words, he was arguing with the chachamim and saying, listen, I hold that the mitzorah doesn't even need it. But why would you say only the mitzorah needs it? Really, everybody needs it. Why are you saying only the mitzorah? So and according to that, it wasn't that Rabbi Yehuda was saying it wasn't that Rabbi Yehuda was saying that the mitzorah requires tevilah in the morning. He was saying, according to you, that he requires tevilah in the morning, fine, but what about everybody else? Why not everyone else? And how will the Chachamim answer that? V'Rabbanan mitzorah daish betumah, kol adam lo daishi betumah. The answer is that a mitzorah we're more concerned about. Why? Because as long as he's been a mitzorah, we don't know how long it's been. He hasn't been careful about any tumah, because why does he have to be careful? What does he care? He's so tameh that it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect him. Whereas a regular person, we don't require to do tevilah when they come to the Beit HaMikdash. You know why? Because we assume a regular person who's tahor wants to stay tahor. But a mitzorah, he's already tameh, so what incentive does he have to stay to avoid tumah? So last night he went to the mikveh, that's true. Before sunset he went to the mikveh, but he's very used to not being careful. And because he's used to not being careful, we make him go to the mikveh again. Rabbi Yehuda says, I'm not concerned about that.
Why?
Because he went last night, and we assume that after he went last night he was going to be careful. Okay? That's what the Chachamim are saying. Now the question is, wait a second. Amar le Abaye le Rav Yosef. Abaye asked Rav Yosef the following question: Neymar Rabbanan de pligya le Rabbi Yehuda keven zoma svira lehu. Should we say that these rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, in other words, the first set of rabbis who said that the mitzorah has to do tevilah in the morning, right? These chachamim at the end are even more lenient than Rabbi Yehuda. They're saying that the average person doesn't have to do tevilah in the morning when he comes to the Beit HaMikdash. But what about the first Chachamim? The first Chachamim that when Rabbi Yehuda said, oh, the Mitzorah doesn't require immersion in the morning because he went last night. The Chachamim said, no, he does. Tovel ve'omed b'shar nikanor. He has to go. So should we say that maybe kiven zoma svira lahu? We could interpret the Chachamim that why did they say that the Mitzorah has to do tevilah in the morning? Because they hold like Ben Zoma. What does Ben Zoma say? No matter what, you have to go to the mikveh when you come in the morning. It's not a practical thing. For Rabbi Yehuda, it's a practical thing. That it will remind you if you had contact with any tum'ah. So with the mitzorah, since he went last night, he doesn't have to go today. According to Ben Zoma, he always has to go. So maybe the Chachamim hold like Ben Zoma. And why does it mention the mitzorah case? Because it's trying to show you that Rabbi Yehuda follows his position consistently, so that he'll be lenient in the case of a mitzorah. Okay, but really the Chachamim would require tevilah in all cases in the morning. It's not that because they agree with Ben Zoma. Why are they specifically addressing a mitzorah? To show you the distinction between them and Rabbi Yehuda. Or maybe Odilma Shani Mitzorah de Daish Betuma. Or maybe the Chachamim actually disagree with Ben Zoma. They say that actually a person who comes to the Beit HaMikdash does not have to go for tevilah. We do not hold that way. Why are we mentioning a mitzorah? Because didayish betum'ah. Because a mitzorah is somebody who's been in the mindset of being tameh for a long time. So even though he went to the mikveh last night, we want him to go again just to be sure that he didn't have contact with anything in the past few hours.
But Rabbi Yehuda doesn't agree.
Rabbi Yehuda doesn't agree. He's more lenient. Okay?
Not only that, it shows kochosh Rabbi Yehuda that
Right, but the question was, do those chachamim say that a mitzorah has to immerse because they say everybody has to immerse? Or no, they're strict only on the mitzorah. Okay, so the answer, so that's what Rav Yosef asked, that's what Abaye asked Rav Yosef. Amar lei shani mitzorah d'daish b'tumah. So Abaye's answer, the answer that Rav Yosef gave to Abaye was, it's only a mitzorah. In other words, you have three opinions. You have Ben Zoma who says, I don't care who you are, I don't care what, you have to go to the mikveh, it's a mitzvah min Torah, you must go. Halacha is from the Torah, you have to go. Rabbi Yehuda says, depends. 99% of people that have to go. But if you're a mitzorah that last night you just went, I'll give you a free ride, you don't have to go. Then you have a third position that says, the Chachamim say, you know what? 99% of people don't have to go to the mikveh. Opposite of Rabbi Yehuda. 99% don't have to. But if you're a mitzorah, we have to be extra strict. Because you're so used to being tameh, you weren't so careful. So we have to enforce so that when you go to the mikveh, you say, oh, you know what, last night I forgot that I messed up. Okay, so that's these are the three opinions. One more point. Amar le Abaye le Rav Yosef. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, Tevilah zo chotzetz o eno chotzetz. So the question is, according to Rashi explains the question like this. According to Rabbi Yehuda, what's the whole reason for the immersion that a person does when they come to the Beit HaMikdash? It's just a reminder. It's not a real immersion, right? They don't really need to go. It's so that they will go to the mikveh and remember if they were tameh or not. So he asked, chotzetz o eno chotzetz? Rashi says that means, do you need to be careful about chatzitzot on your body? You know, like a band-aid or whatever it could be on your body. We call it interposition, something that blocks the water from touching your body. So let's say when a woman goes to the mikveh every month, right, she has to be careful that she doesn't have any band-aid or anything on her body, stuck on her body that would prevent the water from touching her body. So in the same way, any tevilah that you do that's min haTorah, that's a real requirement of tevilah, you have to remove chatzitzot. You have to make sure there's nothing interposing between the water and your body. So the question is, does Rabbi Yehuda require you to remove chatzitzot? Since this tevilah is just symbolic anyway, maybe he's not going to be so strict. That's why Abaye asked. So Rav Yosef said, Amar le, kol de takun Rabbanan, ke'ena deoraita takun. Anything that the rabbis institute, they do it ke'en deoraita. They're going to do it like it's a deoraita, meaning to say that since all tevilot, in other words, what did the rabbis say? They didn't say, fill out a checklist at the door and that will remind you whether you're tameh or not. They said, go to tevilah, and that will remind you if you're tameh or not. So once they say go to tevilah, kol de takun Rabbanan, anything the rabbis make, any law that the rabbis make, they make it ke'in deoraita, the way that the Torah would be. So if they're going to tell you to immerse in the mikveh, that means immerse in the mikveh the halachic way, not a different way. So the halachic way is you have to remove chatzitzot. So to here, even though Rabbi Yehuda says the reason for the halacha is a practical reason, he's still saying that what you need to do is a proper bona fide tevilah.